Hello everybody, welcome back to our virtual classroom and another lesson in our trades training video series. I'm Joe Carswell, and this video is all about a power saw we call the compound miter saw. We're going to break this into two separate videos. The first one is going to be the parts and how to make simple cuts with this saw. The second part is going to be some other things that this saw can do, some more complicated cuts. We're going to follow along with a presentation from Teach Construction as usual, so let's get right into it. This is a great power tool, maybe one of my favorites. And the reason I say that is because it's a great tool to start with if you're trying to learn how a blade cuts through materials. It's also one that's very precise and accurate, and the better you get at it, the more accuracy you can achieve with other tools. There's a lot of concepts that will carry over into your other power tools. The other idea is that this saw, if used properly, is very safe and predictable. So all of these things make a great tool to use on the job site. I call it a semi-stationary power tool. It's one that you're going to carry to the job site, set it up, and bring your materials to it. You would not do the other, whereas a lot of freehand tools will work the other way. To start with, let's go over the parts of this saw. The table is the beginning part. It's going to support the material while we make the cut. This is a precision surface that's perfectly flat. For the precision of the cut, it needs to stay clean and clear at all times. So if you have sawdust, if you have scraps building up, make sure that they get cleared off of the table. The fence is the other precision part of this tool. This is a vertical surface that's a straight edge, basically. The blade is aligned with your fence and your table, and this one needs to make contact with your materials at all times while you're cutting. The trigger handle grip is the point of the saw that gives you the control of the cut. The trigger is inside of this handle, and you're going to keep your finger off of that until you need to use it. It is a simple on-off switch, so as soon as you trip the trigger, it's going to bring the saw up to full speed. It takes a couple of seconds though. The movable blade guard is a part on this saw that's there for safety. It is very similar to, say, a circular saw in that it's spring-loaded, so it always tends to want to be closed. And as you push this saw down into your material, this blade guard will move out of the way automatically. If it's not moving smoothly, or if there's some issue with it, it's getting stuck open, we need to attend to that before we use this saw. The spring arm on a compound miter saw is there to move the blade out of the way when we're not making a cut. This saw wants to be in an upright position. It's our job when we control it to bring it down into the material. It's always going to want to return to this position, and we don't want to let go of this handle, or the saw could literally flip over backwards. A compound miter saw is good to make a lot of angles. We're not going to talk about angles right now. We're going to just work with square cuts or 90-degree cuts. So the miter latch is a feature that's going to allow us to understand and figure out and set this saw to different angles. All that we want to know right now is where to set it for a square cut, and that's going to be setting it at the 0 mark. As you can see in the presentation, the 0 mark is directly in the middle, and this is going to set the cut or the blade 90 degrees relative to the fence. The table on a compound miter saw is only so large. A lot of our materials are much longer than this table. All this material needs to be supported so that when we make our cut, our materials are not falling and flying around and causing uncontrolled cuts that are dangerous and inaccurate. We're going to use some simple props that we call outfeed supports. We've made these. These are just simple 2x4s nailed together. They're going to catch the ends of the boards so that now I have contact here, here, and over there for any materials that I'm cutting. So here you see in the presentation an example of outfeed supports at work. Here we have our outfeed supports. They're providing a point of contact that extends beyond the base or table. And now we have a parallel, completely supported board. And look at all the points of contact we have on this board. This tells me I have a nice solid surface. When I make my cut, nothing's going to move around. Ideally, because of this photograph and the limits of the width of this photograph, you're going to move those outfeed supports as wide as possible to the ends of the boards so you get the most amount of support. So let's bring a board in here and I can demonstrate that a little easier. Here I've got an 8-foot 2x4. let's say I wanted to cut it somewhere in the center here. So what I have is, I know my blade's going to hit here. My board is supported from here to here, but once I make this cut, without these outfeed supports here, the boards are going to just lean over and fall out. That's going to be while the blade's spinning and while I have both hands occupied. That's not the ideal situation. My outfeed supports will get pushed as far out on the table to effectively support that board. Now I'm in good shape and I'm ready to make my cut. When I make this cut, nothing is going to happen. The boards will not move, the blade will pass through the material, and everything will hold still. That's ideal, and that's the best setup for a cut. The next thing to talk about is proper hand placement when we're making cuts. The hand that's operating the saw, which in this case is going to be your right hand, is always safe. It's never near the blade and it will never be at risk of injury. Your left hand, however, as you can see in the presentation, is always holding and supporting the board. It's going to hold it tight to the fence and tight to the table. And while it is there, it is the closest hand to the spinning blade. So hand placement is one of the main things to keep safe with this compound miter saw. I'm going to show you correct hand placement, which is here, is outside of this fence edge. If you keep your hand outside of here, no matter what kind of cut you're making, if you develop that habit, there is no chance for injury to that supporting hand. So this is a good setup for hand placement when cutting any cuts, whether that's a square cut or angles. The more you use the saw, the more comfortable you get with it, and your hand will tend to creep in closer to the blade. This is a bad idea. It only takes a fraction of a second for something to go wrong. Your hand gets drawn into a blade spinning at high RPMs, and the next thing you know, you're missing some fingers. So this is absolutely no good. This is a little better situation, but we're still, if we remember this idea of being beyond the fence, this is still encroaching on the blade. I'm going to show you some angle cuts later where your hand would actually be in the path of the blade here. So this is a bad habit to develop, because even though at this moment you might not be near the blade, if it was to grab the board or you were to forget and set it at an angle, this could become a very dangerous situation very quickly. So this is a non-starter here for this position. On the list of things not to do, this is one of the biggest violations. We're going to call this crosshand cutting, and I see this a lot more than you think you would. It looks crazy when you look at it in the presentation, and it actually is if you think about it. You're literally putting your supporting hand in the path of the blade that's going to come down and then cut the material. A lot of times this happens because instead of the person using logic when they're placing the board on the saw, this is a right-handed person and they're holding the piece. First they're placing the piece on the wrong side of the saw, so now they're using their supporting hand to hold it down. The right setup would be to place it on this side so that you have the most logical placement of your supporting hand. So in review, let's look at the proper hand placement one more time. You can see here that the supporting hand is outside the edge of the fence. That makes all of this dangerous area in here off limits to any fingers, thumbs, or any part of your hand. Let's go through the steps of making a simple square cut using a compound miter saw on a simple 2x4. We're going to start with, and keep in mind I'm in back of the saw and behind it to give you the viewpoint of the user. Later I'll do it from the correct angle, and then we'll also actually do it out in the shop. So here I have my 2x4. This 2x4 needs to make contact with the table base, and it needs to be supported with an outfeed support. You can push that outfeed support as far out as the table can hold it, and that will give you the most control. The next thing we want to do is to check our miter gauge. Make sure it's locked in at the 0 mark. The next thing we need to do is to double check that our bevel gauge is locked at 0. Our bevel is going to adjust this way, and I will show you that procedure later. The last thing to do is you want to align the blade up with the mark on your board. So here I have a mark on my board, and I'm going to slide this material back and forth as I've lowered the blade down to it. I'm not turning the saw on. The saw is still, and I want to move that material back and forth to try to line that blade up with my mark that I've made. When we talk about lining the blade up, we need to talk about exactly where. that comes into a term we call kerf. This is a name that we're going to call for the slot that the blade is going to cut through the wood as it passes through and turns all of that extra material into sawdust. Now that we have placed our board, we've supported it, and now we've aligned our blade with our mark, we have to actually make the cut here. What we want to do is to make sure that our hand placement is outside of the fence. Number one, we need pressure on the board down to hold it tight to the table and back so it's tight against the fence. You want to make sure there's no gaps, full contact for the entire length of the fence. Now we're going to pull the trigger on the motor while it's raised. We want to get it up to speed, full speed. Now we're going to push that saw through the material at a specific constant speed. We're listening to the speed. We want it to be continuous and not slow down, not too fast, not too slow. Once we're done with the cut and it's down completely in the lowered position, you can release the trigger, the motor will come to a stop, then you can lift the saw out of the cut. Now we can move our board, go do what we needed to do. Now what I want to do is to do this step-by-step process of making a cut from the other side of the table. I'm going to do my best to stay out of your way so you get a good view of what's going on. Here we are out in the shop. I want to go through a simple squared cut in a 2x4 with our compound miter saw. As you can see here, I've got everything set up. I got a nice flat solid table on a couple of sawhorses. I've got my miter saw ready to go, and I've got 2 outfeed supports. Let's get to it. First things first, safety glasses at all times when this tool's running. So here I've got my piece of wood. You can see I've got my mark on the wood, and I'm going to keep my supporting hand is outside of the fence. I want to point this out really quick. See how much adjustability I have of that board if I keep my hand outside of the fence. If I have my hand in here, not only is it dangerous, but I cannot move or adjust that piece of wood at all. So keep your hand out here. It actually makes for more accurate work. I've got my hand on the handle but off the trigger. I'm going to lower the blade, and I'm adjusting my wood to the edge of that blade, keeping my kerf on the scrap side of the board, which is this side right here. Here's my scrap side. So now I'm going to lower and align my blade to that mark. I like that right there, so I'm going to hold my board. I've got it tight up against the fence, tight to the table. Now I'm going to back the saw off of the material enough that it won't make contact. Now I'll pull the trigger and make the cut. So it's slow and steady through the material. You didn't hear the motor working or binding. Now I've got my cut, my blade guard is in place. I'm going to take my pieces. I got my scrap in the trash, and now this piece is done. That's a simple squared cut in a compound miter saw. Let's do one more cut. I've made a mark, and I've marked for my scrap on the board. I want my 2x4 tight up against the fence, no gaps, and solid to the table. My hand's outside of the edge of the fence, and I can make my adjustments. I'm going to lower this saw, no fingers on the trigger, and I'm going to line my blade up with my kerf on the scrap side. I like that, so now I'm going to back the saw off of the material just enough that it can spin freely. I'm going to pull the trigger and then make my cut. Finger off the trigger, let it come to a halt. Blade guard covers the blade. Now I'm done with my cut. That's a simple cut on a 2x4. So here we are at the end of part 1 of our miter saw video. Now you know the basics of how the saw works and how to make a squared cut. Keep your hand outside of this fence so you take all 10 of your fingers home with you at the end of the day. So I'll see you in the next video. We'll go over some more advanced things to do with this saw. This video is a production of Trade Skills U, all rights reserved. If you provide instruction in the construction trades and have a need for videos like these, please contact us at tradeskillsu.com.